Hola, ¿cómo está? Me llamo Cade, and you are watching Cade's Crap. I am all suited up today because I have some very exciting information to share. I have finally finished Wicked the book. It did take me a hot minute, I'm not gonna lie. Ever since I was a small child, I have been obsessed with musicals, and Wicked has been one of those musicals. And when I was the age of like 12 or something, my best Nana ever gave me the best presents ever, and I got to see Wicked on Broadway. Before, I had been obsessed with Hamilton and Heathers, then Dear Evan Hansen, Be More Chill, Next to Normal, blah blah blah. But before seeing Wicked on Broadway, I was never as into it because Wicked is a musical that is more plot heavy outside of the songs, and so I never really got as into the story because obviously it's technically illegal to record plays and post them online for free. So when I finally saw it on stage with my Nana, I was obsessed, and my brain chemistry was forever changed. And years later, my brain rot was all brought back to me full force, clear as day, when the first Wicked movie came to theaters in 2024. I saw it with my sister, who'd never really heard of the musical, and she quickly became just as obsessed as I was. Now, part of the reason I've always loved Wicked, aside from the fact that it's just an interesting premise with good characters and good music, was the fact that there was political and moral exploration hidden between every bright outfit and love triangle. And as I watched the new movies, each one as they came out, I saw the differences in how the movie portrayed the story and how the play musical portrayed the story. Now, a huge part of Wicked is hinging on Elphaba being pretty radical and protesting for the rights of animals. Now, in Oz, there are two types of animals. In the book, they are distinguished as either being lowercase or beginning with an uppercase, in the way that you wouldn't capitalize the phrase somebody's father, but you should capitalize the phrase father if you're referring to them as a proper noun. The animals, the ones who are proper nouns, are creatures who with the same mental, social, intellectual, spiritual, whatever capacity as people. In the book, it's very easy to distinguish this because obviously lowercase versus capitalization, but in the musicals and movies, in mediums where this information has to be displayed through, spoken word, through verbiage, it is not as effective. And I suspect that's why the musical and the movies don't really address the fact that there is a difference between the two. But I digress. A huge difference I saw in the movies coming out between the musical was the existence of a new character, Nanny Bear. Nanny Bear had not existed in the play, which left me wondering if she had existed in the book, perhaps. Nanny Bear added a great amount of depth to Elphaba's character because it gave her a personal relationship to the discrimination of animals and the gradual abolition of their rights. With poor relations to her parents, Dulcie Bear was Elphaba's main caregiver in the movie, someone who cared for her and Nessa and who raised her. Elphaba saw compassion and respect from animals in a way that no one who was quote-unquote normal and human had ever treated her. This simply wasn't as much of a dynamic in the play. So that got me really curious about the book, wondering if they had taken these concepts from the book and repurposed them for the movie. So after some meandering and distraction, I finally read and finished the damn book. So here we go. The movies felt like sort of a natural evolution and readaptation of the Broadway musical, so when I began the book, I sort of assumed it was something that would be more or less a little bit like the play musical, obviously with a bit more detail they had to omit for, a shorter show and to be able to have a readable stage performance. But what I read instead rather surprised me, actually. The beginning of this book was so bizarre that I started to worry if the book was anything like the musical or movies. The stories I loved so much, and if I would instead read an older, largely, unlikable book that had inspired something else completely different to be adapted from it. After a brief prologue of the witch, Elphaba stalking Dorothy and her friends, the book starts on the day Elphaba is to be born. Elphaba's father, Frex, is a priest, and her mom is a rich girl who loves to sleep with strangers but ran away from her life as the next eminence to be with her poor priest hubby. Frex, the poor priest hubby, is pretty explicitly, he's explicitly aware that Belena is a hoe, but he doesn't really seem to care. I don't think any of their kids end up actually being Frex's, which is pretty funny. He's basically a cuck. Anyway, not really the point. Frex is extremely religious to a frustrating degree. To be specific, he's what they call a unionist in this book. He believes in the unnamed God and also that technology, which is referred to as TikTokism, and that magic are sinful practices or pastimes. Basically, what he's doing instead of being, with his family while his first child, Elphaba, is being born, is he's trying to stop his congregates from watching a carnival-esque TikTok show called The Time Dragon, which allegedly predicts the future or exposes the past. Now, I have to admit this sounds pretty nonsensical. That is because this is one of those fantasy books where you are kind of just thrust headfirst into a bunch of terms and shenanigans that do not make sense in the context of our world, and you have to slowly figure out, how this world and this lore works and what is normal in their context. And then Elphaba is born. She's green and with giant sharp teeth. These random lady neighbors were the ones who came to midwife for Milena. Even though they hate Milena, they just felt bad, I guess. And then Milena passes out after delivering Elphaba. All these ladies, they're passing around terrible, horrible insults about the baby they just delivered, and then they agreed they should probably just kill her. But then one of the women gives Elphaba like a finger to nurse on, and Elphaba just clean bites it off. So the ladies freak the fuck out. They decide not to kill her after all, and they skedaddle. Period, I guess. A huge reason why this book is like so, I guess, bleak compared to the musicals is because of the way that Elphaba and later other characters are mistreated in such like a realistic but nasty, sour way. Like it's not even funny. It's just depressing and frustrating because her parents grieve and they don't want her. She's treated like a demon before she even has like the chance to live. Her mom Elena becomes basically a drunk because she doesn't know how to handle Elphaba being green and being hashtag not like other girls. So she calls on her childhood nanny to come and help them out. Nanny is the character that Dulcie Bear, I assume, was based off of. But Nanny in the book is human and also way different of a character personality-wise than Dulcie Bear in the movie. Nanny is stern, she's rude, but she's fiercely maternal and caregiving. She doesn't need to like Elphaba or to think that she's a normal, beautiful baby in order to take care of her well, and also take care of her mom, Elena. Nanny is blunt enough to say, honestly, what needs to be said to fuck-ass parents who are too busy wallowing in their loss at having a not normal child to raise, the child they actually fucking have. And obviously, Elphaba turns out fine and not as a violent demon, just like a normal child who is also socially stunted and scarred by the way people treat her. When she's a toddler, a traveler comes to their cottage, a quadling named Turtleheart. Quadlings are like small humanoid creatures that live separated from most of Oz in swamps, and they don't tend to mingle because of like different cultures, I guess. But Turtleheart wanted to travel and to meet other cultures because his cultural home in the swamps was being destroyed by the wizard, who wanted to mine whatever rubies and gems might be out there. Classic colonizer story. Anyway, Turtleheart ends up living there with them, and pretty explicitly being in a throuple with Milena and Frex. Like, canonically, they're all three together. First he sleeps with Milena, and then he and Frex meet, and they get kind of fruity with it out by the fire at night. Then Milena gets pregnant again, which is going to be Nessa Rose. It's sort of unknown and vague as to whether Nessa was born disabled because her father was a quadling, which is a different species, or if it was the copious amount of drugs that Milena took while she was pregnant. Perhaps a mixture of both. The most notable part of Nessa Rose, I think, that is different than the book is that instead of her legs being malformed and her needing a wheelchair, Nessa Rose's legs are fine in the book. It's that she was born completely without arms, just like little nubs where they should be. So she had a very hard time standing without aid or balance, and also doing a lot of things that, inevitably require arms and hands. The next section of the book, finally, is about Elphaba's time at Shiz. We see this part of the book from multiple perspectives, Glinda's, Vox, and of course, Elphaba's. But up until Elphaba's segment of POV in this second segment of the book, the entire book has been told from the eyes and perspectives of other characters. We are getting Elphaba's life story, but from the perspective of the people who raised her or were around her from a young age, which isn't necessarily the same as if we were asking her ourselves. This is something that I think the book explores in an interesting way, even if it's not as obvious as other themes. A lot of the characters are completely different in their roles and what happens with their arcs than they are in the musical adaptations, and there's also several more characters in the book, as one can imagine. Bach is a Munchkinlander who actually grew up playing with Elphaba as a toddler before she moved away to the Quadling Swamps with her family. Bach goes to a neighboring school. He lives in Briscoe Hall, which is where the men go, and the women go to Craig Hall. So like the genders are like separated. They don't go to the same school, basically. There's too many terms and places thrown around in this book, so for the sake of simplicity, I'll just say that Briscoe is where the boys go and Craig is where the girls go. They might be called other things at times in the book. I don't know. I'm confused. Please help. Anyway, the genders being separated is both frustrating and interesting because it gives the book another thematic layer, mostly about misogyny and how women are not just rejected opportunities men might have, but in fact educated into being more docile and vain. Elphaba later calls Craig Hall more like brainwashing than schooling. This quote is towards the end of the book, much later, but from Elphaba's perspective, quote, "The witch could not picture Dorothy, but for a moment she saw the stooped figure of Nor." Nor is a different character for later. She saw a crowd of girls, like Nor, in chains and yokes, drifting around Madame Morrible in the way that those schoolgirls had all those years ago. End quote. She is directly comparing her schooling to a political prisoner who was driven mad by being locked away and tortured. So, so there you go. That's what Shiz was like for women. That is another reason why the book is so much darker, grittier, and realistic than the musicals ever were. The book does not shy away or try to sanitize how these types of things go in realistic settings. It discusses abuse. It discusses generational trauma, misogyny, racial allegories, colonialism, totalitarianism, issues pertaining to religion, and even ableism, and all of the intersections that go into these things. It was deeply unsettling to read about, even if it was so well written with good prose and witty, deliciously flawed characters. I would have to stop reading from time to time because, unlike a lot of media that explores dark themes, it didn't hold things back. And that meant it didn't give you a good, satisfying ending to make you feel better. It made you sit. It made you think. And once or twice, I may or may not have been on the verge of crying. Because while this story is about a fantasy world with girls that have green skin, animals that talk, and philosophy clubs that are actually weird sex groups, there are so many things baked into here that are extremely relevant to the real world. Wicked the book is a perfect example, I think, of exploring trauma and dark themes through escapist fiction. It's also a fantastic exploration of its premise, which is questioning what evil is, and if evil truly exists. If so, why, and how to stop it. While the musical has pretty obvious lines, especially in the Wizard song Wonderful, like, "Elphaba, where I'm from, we believe all sorts of things that aren't true. We call it history." And all the other lyrics about is a man a traitor, a liberator, a thief, or philanthropist? It's all in which label is able to persist. Like, the whole song is about how stories are formed largely by propaganda and word of mouth, then which version is the most popular, not really based on what happens truthfully. But Wicked, the musical, overall, is pretty fun. It's colorful. A bunch of the tension is about a love triangle instead of, political violence, and the horror of being a minority that's targeted by that violence, and then, the intersection of being a minority who gets certain privileges above other minorities. Hell, the book even goes into pretty privilege a little bit. In the book, Elphaba is never super into sorcery, and while she's never been shown to be explicitly bad at it, she just doesn't become a sorcerer. Especially not in the way that she is a prodigy in the musicals. I assume, that the musical probably just needed a simpler, less complicated way to form the plot and include the wizard, because the wizard's involvement in the book makes sense, but also requires you to know several layers of lore and things that happen in the book first. I truly believe that this play would have had the complexity and entertainment value of a Shakespeare if it was true to the book, which no one would want to watch with our collective goldfish attention spans, unfortunately. So I'm not necessarily dogging on the adaptations. I'm just really shocked at, how different these versions really are. True to the story we all know, Elphaba becomes close to Dr. Dillamond, who is a radical supporter of animals' rights. He is an animal himself. He's a goat, and he's a professor at Shiz. If you haven't, watched Wicked, which I'm kind of assuming that everybody watching this video at least knows the basics of Wicked. Anyway, the first scene we see of Dr. Dillamond is actually through Glinda's perspective, who finds him annoying and petulant because he's bringing up the fact that animals are soon to be outlawed from using public transportation, and they'll have to ride with the livestock, which is obviously humiliating and dehumanizing. Dr. Dillamond is very much like a concise, blunt, and kind person who is often the only fucking person in the room who understands the weight of discrimination most people just brush off. Mostly because he has to deal firsthand with facing it, but like every character simultaneously respects Dillamond specifically, but also has no qualms with legislation or propaganda that affect animals' rights. It's so frustrating, but it's also kind of really real. I won't comment on people of color's experience because I feel like the animal allegory is more closely related to chattel slavery and racism. But as a trans person, the experience of people accepting you and being like, oh, I know you're a good, smart person who deserves rights, paired with their dissonance of, but I think this anti-trans law still really makes sense to me, is so insanely mind-boggling. Then being seen as way too passionate when you care about the issues at all, because apparently it doesn't matter if people have rights or not. I don't know, I just find this a really amazing depiction, if I'm honest. So anyway, Elphaba is lured in by Dr. Dillamond's passion for proving why animals should be treated equally. She joins in and helps him with his research and experiments where he sets out to prove that animals are just as biologically adept as people are. This is all very secret and hush-hush because obviously there's an animal genocide happening at the moment, and Dillamond doesn't want his work discovered until he has something concrete to defend his stance with. Elphaba ends up roping in Bok and Bok's male friends, Crope, Tibbet, and eventually Averick, since they have access to the Three Queens and Briscoe library that female students, like Elphaba, don't. So they all end up forming this really cute, passionate and tight-knit rebellion group. They're helping out Dr. Dillamond, although Elphaba gets closer and closer to Glinda, and Bok keeps trying to court Glinda, despite never getting anywhere with that. And for a moment, I thought Bok might be Elphaba's love interest instead of Fiyero, who was very much a side character in the background during this segment of the book. And I think it could have been cute with their dynamics in the book, but I also really adore their close platonic relationship. Glinda and Elphaba, however, I still ship in the book, even if it's only when they're in college together, because a huge contention is that we see all of these characters later at the end of the book, where they're all in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, they're grown up, and they're either just straight up not good people or disappointing at best. Except for Averick. His flavor of asshole aged like wine, I must say. I did not like him at all in the college segment of the book, but in the later part of the book, I would definitely go to his dinner parties as an older adult. Anyway, Fiyero has nothing to do with Glinda, but does still end up being a love interest for Elphaba. The love triangle with Glinda just isn't a thing in the book. Anyway, surprise, surprise, Dr. Dillamond is onto something. He thinks he's found something, basically. But right as he has this epiphany, he is mysteriously found dead in the middle of the night in his lab, and the only witness to the murder is Emma Clutch, who immediately went mad and subsequently passed away as well. Most people accepted the cover-up as, an accident in the lab, not a homicide, but Elphaba knows better, of course. This was a deliberate political assassination, and she wants to do something about it. So, after Emma Clutch's funeral, after being threatened and manipulated in a room alone with Madame Morrible, she and Glinda go to Emerald City to find the wizard. At this point, Elphaba is still pretty naive, I would say, and has hope that if she can explain why all of this anti-animal legislative bullfuckery is wrong, and then, add on the fact that Dr. Dillamond was just murdered, then the wizard might, at the very least, rethink his decisions. Instead, of course, he's sexist towards them, he downplays everything, says some racist bullshit about animals. He even says, which I find interesting, I do not listen when anyone uses the word immoral. In the young, it is ridiculous. In the old, it is oh my god. In the old, it is sententious and the reactionary and an early warning sign of apoplexy. In the middle aged, who love and fear the idea of moral life the most, it is hypocritical. I just found that quote interesting. I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, if that did not radicalize Elphaba against, her government, I don't know what else did. After that, she sends Glinda back to Shiz. She says goodbye. They kiss. And then Elphaba becomes a political agent of the Knights. Elphaba leads like a very sad, lonely, private life. She has no contact with anyone. She kind of just disappears. Nobody even knows if she's alive at this point. Until years later, Fiyero runs into her and he recognizes her, so he harasses her until she admits that she is in fact Elphaba and that, she does recognize him from school. Fiyero, in the book, is a tribal prince of the Arahikis. I don't know how it's actually supposed to be pronounced, but, I'll put how it's spelled on screen or something. Do with that as you will. I absolutely love the way that Fiyero is described in the book, with very dark brown skin and bright blue diamonds decorating him. Like, that's just so beautiful and gives you like a great picture in your mind. Fiyero is married, but it was an arranged marriage that, he's been in since he was a little kid, so, it's more of a political partnership, where they also, make kids together than a traditional romantic marriage. Enough said, Elphaba and Fiyero start sleeping together, and Fiyero learns more about the political struggle, even if Elphaba is more, secretive and avoidant for safety reasons. Fiyero is also very worried about her safety, and he puts off going back home to his family in Kiamoko because he wants to, have sex with her and also protect her, the mistress, instead of his kids, like the amazing baby daddy he is. Elphaba explicitly warns him to stay the fuck away during this one specific day. He just has to stay away for one day, or he will be in, a lot of danger. She assures him that she will be fine, she knows what to do, but he needs to stop being a toxic, masculine freak and just trust her to stay safe for one day, or he will be murked by the government. But of course, he's a dumb bitch, and he can't trust her to take care of herself, so he follows her, and then big surprise, he gets murked, and Fiyero dies. Elphaba is, vaguely pregnant, and I say vaguely because it's not very explicitly confirmed in the book, even if me and the narrator both know it's the truth. Elphaba, after losing Fiyero and not being able to complete her assassination of the bitch-ass villain Madame Morrible goes to a Montery, which is basically a nun convent. She gives birth and is in a coma for a while, then she works there for 7 years or something like that. She basically just gives up on her political inclinations and she lives a quiet life, and she becomes a nurse and cares for their equivalent of hospice patients. One of her patients ends up being an old college friend, Tibbet, who sort of takes her out of this weird funk of dissociation she's in, where she doesn't really feel like an individual, just another woman wearing a uniform. He reminds her that she is a person, she was a person, and he demands her to live her life. So when he dies, she was sort of low-key forced by the superior Mons to go out into the world again. So she goes to find Fiyero's family in search for forgiveness. Elphaba's child, obviously fathered by Fiyero, is named Lear, but never really referred to as her child. He's kind of just in her proximity. He goes with her as a boy on, this big trip to find Kiamoko, which is the palace where Fiyero ruled from. But she never really calls him her child, and Lear never calls her his mom. It's an extremely dysfunctional and emotionally stunted relationship, and Elphaba is a very shitty mom. She isn't even sure that he's her kid, even though it's obvious. She's just in denial because she doesn't remember hardly anything directly following Fiyero's death. So she just, never treats him like he's her son, I guess. This is the point of the book where it all felt kind of meandering, and yet again I began to question, the quality of the novel, doubting how relevant all of these seemingly off-topic things were. After finishing the novel, though, I recognize it as a natural part of the book because At the heart of it, this is Elphaba's, complete life story, and no one's life is really going to be super cohesive as a linear plot. So I started to get a little bit bored, and it was only a bit later that I got interested again as things started to pick up and feel more eminently important to the story. Something I did enjoy, though, about the book is that I had no real idea where the plot was actually going, even if I was a fan of the adaptations. Like, they were so different that it was like I read fan fictions my entire life, and then I suddenly picked up, like, a giant classic novel, and I had a connection. That's an exaggeration. This book honestly isn't that hard to read. It was just really heavy, so I had to take my time with it. Anyway, Elphaba ends up living with Fiero's wife, Sarima, and her kids and sisters in Kiyomoko. She's sort of forbidden from talking about Fiero and basically gets majorly cockblocked every time that she tries to be forgiven. It's very apparent that the forgiveness is far more about, Elphaba's peace of mind than it is about actually making Sarima feel better. There's definitely an interesting exploration in the last third or so of the book about guilt and the psychological need for people to feel forgiven, but the reality that it's a selfish need, and most of the time it's never fulfilled. I find it interesting that all the older characters end up having regrets, which is especially a parallel between Elphaba and her father Frex, but there's no true way to fix the way that your mistakes haunt you. If anything, it makes both of the characters worse people, as the lack of redemption just makes them angry and feel helpless. As a young person, it makes me wonder if having regrets is simply part of being alive, like those embarrassing childhood memories you were definitely in the wrong for retrospectively, except, like way more serious than that. The older you get, does the pain of things you could have done better only grow, or do you only have to strengthen your skill of ignoring and moving on? There's definitely a strong sense that Elphaba is a brooding character who never moves on. She only stews in the past until it makes her insane by the end of the book, to every character and eventually the reader as well. Elphaba is so upset and mentally disturbed by everything, all of the above, everything that happened in the book, that while it makes sense that she was practically on the verge of killing innocent Dorothy, it would also make complete sense if, Dorothy decided to actually murder Elphaba on purpose, which she didn't. The witch caught on fire, and Dorothy incorrectly assumed that water would save her from the fire. How the adaptations end is with Fiero being the Scarecrow and the witch secretly surviving, so that they can run off and live together happily ever after. But Book Elphaba is not so lucky. Actually, the whole idea of Fiero being the Scarecrow and actually not being dead was a mentally ill delusion that Elphaba had in the last pages of the book before Dorothy's crew arrived. She hoped that the Scarecrow was secretly him, but it definitely was not. Elphaba definitely dies, and that's definitely the end of the book. There's also no one really left alive that could have possibly told the whole story. Since Nessa Rose is dead, Frex is dying, Nanny probably dies shortly thereafter, but who knows, she could be immortal, and then Glinda is sort of in on the political tomfoolery, and Bach is so domestic and peaceful to the point that he's completely ignorant, and he would probably be on Dorothy's side after the mental breakdown that Elphaba had on his lawn. There's also like some weird kind of like surreal lore along with everything else. So the wizard is from the other world, and there's also some reoccurring cryptid-like figures who reappear, like throughout the story. There's the dwarf and there's Yackle. Now, Yackle's goals are kind of dubious, and the dwarf's job is to make sure that the Grimoire stays safe. The Grimoire, the huge book of spells and other important information you might need and expect, and how to be a successful tyrant. The Grimoire was actually hidden in Kiyomoko on purpose by a different wizard who was also from the other world, who was more powerful and benevolent than the Wizard of Oz. He kind of just brought it there before he died because he knew that nobody in Kiyomoko was educated or interested enough to even know what the book was, so it sat in a dusty room for a really long time, until Elphaba found it. And the whole reason that the Wizard of Oz was there in the first place is because he was looking for the Grimoire, and his job was to bring the Grimoire back to the other world. Anyway, Elphaba finds the Grimoire. She could sort of read it, but not very well, and no one else she showed it to could read it. Still, she found it really interesting, and she kept trying to read it. Eventually, after she has her mental breakdown towards the end of the book, she finally murders elderly Madame Morrible, who was already on her deathbed anyway. She gets plastered with Averick and his rich friends, and then she goes on a drunken walk. She finds the dwarf, and the dwarf explains a bit of this lore. He also tells her through a time dragon puppet show that her real father is the Wizard of Oz. So the only reason that she can read the Grimoire is because she's partially not from this world. It's all very complex and strange, especially when Elphaba with this new information, starts taking Miracle Elixir, who Nanny got from Yackle, the other cryptid from the other world. And she takes this Miracle Elixir, she starts having crazy ass dreams about the other world and about the Wizard of Oz. But then she finally has like a terrible nightmare, and she decides that sleep is for the weak, and she uses drugs to keep herself from sleeping altogether. I find it interesting that Elfie is not only misunderstood by history in the way that her story with Dorothy is then told, but she's also misunderstood by all the other characters while these things are happening. She's misunderstood to the point that she doesn't even quite understand the weight of certain things that have happened to her until it's probably too late. She's such a strong and flawed character with confident ideas about morality, but a lot less success actually putting that morality out into the world. She chastises others for speaking of animals poorly, but doesn't think twice about, threatening to beat her son. She crashes out when Bach is a political fence sitter, but to date, Elphaba's activism has never done anyone good. Not herself, not the animals, not Fiero especially. And Elphaba, at the end of the day, isn't even an animal. And though her passion is admirable, at one point in the book there is a scene where she's put in her place by an animal. Nessa Rose is the Eminence, which is basically a queen of Munchkinland at that point, and this is all just background bullshit, but she bargained a spell for a farmer in return for like some of their animals. Elphaba goes to free these animals. She finds it very offensive that they are reduced to livestock and slaves to be traded, which, like, true. She declares that she's there to free the cow and the sheep, which the cow replies with, and free to go where? To do what? We'd get from here to Lower Muckslap and be roped in again, subjected to slavery under the wizard, and catechisms under the eminent Throp. When Elphaba feels offended for the cow not being grateful for her granting her freedom, the cow just continues. Quote, "Sweetheart, my udder is sore from their daily yanking. I'm tapped for milk, morning and night. I won't even go what it's like to be mounted by it. Well, never mind. But worst, my children have been fattened on milk and slaughtered for veal. I could hear their cries from the abattoir. They didn't even bother to move me out of hearing range." End quote. And that quote, when I read it, hit me really hard. I just really like how the book puts Elphaba in her place as a person of so much privilege who, even though she rightly cares about the cause a lot, she has no real idea what it's like to be an animal. She knows that it's wrong. She knows how they're treated is despicable, but her simple mindset of how easy the problem is to fix is read more like meaningless pandering when it comes to animals who have to live with that experience. Being resigned to dehumanization, to know that there is no escape, there is no freedom, not even if a fancy-pantsy eminent Thrupp declares you to go be free. Elphaba wants there to be a solution. She wants to provide a solution because who wouldn't? But she can't, and the fact that she thinks she can is laughable to the cow and her sheep friends. It's laughable because, as a privileged person, Elphaba is naive to the way that animal racism and chattel slavery works. That was a part that almost made me cry, not because of the emotion displayed in the characters necessarily, but because of how dark and real it felt, sitting with the fact that some evils are too prevalent to deal with as a person of privilege, even if you mean well. Like taking my whiteness out of the equation because it's not about me. The fact that real people have, and on this planet, still go through those things, have to live like that, or similar, with no escape, and no hope of escape. Holy fucking shit. That is why I had to take my time with this book, because I was pulling so many similarities even just from my Black American history class. Like, it's terrible. And there's no way to sugarcoat it. It's just fucking terrible. Another part of this book that made me uncharacteristically emotional was Elphaba's relationship with her father. Our daddy issues are absolutely not the same, but I empathize with them a lot, and I really enjoyed like the slow burn and the full-rounded way that they were presented. The way that they still loved each other in between the terrible comments he made and the things he did and didn't do, and the way his adoration for precious little Nessa Rose made Elphaba the undesirable one. The way he didn't even seem to realize the way he treated Elphaba, how it was wrong, or how he was ever at fault. How she had to be strong for her father and not the other way around. And finally, towards the end, a passage about the little Elphaba inside of her, who Frex was to little Elfie. In the Quadling Swamps, Frex brought child Elphaba along to Turtleheart's family, where he asked for forgiveness for feeling like he was partly at fault for Turtleheart's death. Turtleheart's family refuses to forgive him, however, because their culture doesn't believe in forgiveness. But Frex can't accept that. The rest reads, he points to Elphaba and says, not to Elphaba, but to them all. Isn't this punishment enough? Elphaba, the girl, does not know how to see her father as a broken man. All she knows is that he passes his brokenness onto her. Daily, his habits of loathing and self-loathing cripple her. Daily, she loves him back because she knows no other way. Elphaba, to him, was a curse, a punishment, but to her, he was her dad. He died grieving devastatingly beautiful Nessa Rose, leaving the audience to wonder if he would have been on his deathbed of heartache if Elphaba was the one who died before Nessa. Elfie's upbringing gives her so much inherited brokenness and inherited rage. In the last pages, while the witch waits for Dorothy to arrive, Elphaba thinks about religion as someone who was raised by a minister but never believed in anything spiritual. She wishes that she could believe in the unnamed god in a way, or even an alternative deity like Lurlina, at least something that would comfort her soul, or lack thereof. This is the last passage I'll share because I found it profound in the way that, like, you know, what Maguire had to say here. If you could take the skewers of religion, those that riddle your frame, make you aware every time you move, if you could withdraw the scimitars of religion from your mental and moral systems, could you even stand? Or do you need religion as, say, the hippos in the grasslands need the poisonous little parasites within them to help digest fiber and pulp? The history of peoples who have shucked religion isn't an especially persuasive argument for living without it. Is religion itself, that tired and ironic phrase, the necessary evil? End quote. This is definitely something I've thought about myself as the young agnostic person that I am. I really value how this book not only explores religion in proximity to politics, but also the fundamental human need to comfort yourself and your community with spirituality. I did also like the quote, "Would we recognize the unnamed God if it knocked on our doors?" Because I find it kind of even relevant to politics today in the real world. There is no way you or I would recognize and then believe Jesus if he knocked on our doors right now. And in a way, doesn't that make the unnamed God something and nothing all at the same time? A concept to comfort oneself more than, you know, like a concrete person or figurehead. A loose belief in a benevolent authority without enough detail for the reality of absolute authority to, you know, destroy your illusion of safety. Uh-oh, where did the rest of my script go? I lost the rest of my script, but luckily that was most of what I had to say. I found this book really moving, I guess you could say, even if at times it was hard for me to read, and at times I sort of doubted how much I would like it compared to the musical adaptations. I definitely like both in their own right. I think that the musicals are very much more lighthearted and fun, and I love the music, I love the characters, they're more like my scrunkly little characters that I can think about, and the book is very much more serious and has really a lot to say with what Gregory Maguire was trying to do with the story. He was trying to capitalize on the popularity of the Wizard of Oz in a way that was really subversive and interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I liked what he had to say. I enjoyed it. So definitely beware when you read this book. Maybe I'm just like really way too hyper empathetic when I read things, but this book, yeah, it was a lot for me. Even if I loved it a lot, I just really loved it. And I also need to say another hot take. We need to stop making Fiyero white because Fiyero was fucking black in the book, and I love the idea of him being black with a blue diamond tattoo, like bright blue diamond tattoos, way more than him just like being a generic white man. So, you know, there's that. I also really like the idea of, because I've always, you know, with the musicals, I've always liked Glinda, Fiyero, and Elphaba. Like, I've imagined them all together in kind of like a throuple situation. I like that, you know, Elphaba's parents were also in a throuple. It's just like a family thing, I guess. Anyway, that's all I really have to say. This video is a bit long and the sun is going down. So, yeah. Fucking see you next time, I guess. Bye.